In this video, we'll be taking a look at mental ray render settings using the still life mental ray VO2 file found in the scenes folder of your lighting project. I already have it open, and a quick look in the scene will reveal a spotlight that's been enabled as a mental ray area light. The area light has a linear decay with an intensity of 8 and has ray trace shadows turned on. Quick look at the mental ray render settings will reveal a few tabs. The most important tab to take a look at and understand is the quality tab. The top attributes in the quality tab to pay attention to are the sampling. This governs the quality of the overall render with min and max sample levels and the aliasing contrast threshold. The sampling mode gives you a choice between three. We'll leave it at adaptive sampling right now, and I've rendered this camera here, and we'll see quite a bit of noise all over the render. It looks like an old dirty newspaper. One of the things that we'll want to do is take a look at the light itself, because mental ray area light has samples built into it itself. High samples here under the area light will mitigate the noise that you see on the fruit in the middle. So let's go ahead and we'll double these numbers. Again, this is found under the mental ray heading for the light itself. And with high samples of 6, we'll go ahead and render. Now with this render, you can see there's far less noise inside the fruit, inside the still life itself. So the sampling in the light has helped mitigate some of that. However, at the edges, especially here on the stems and the round parts of the fruit, you have very jagged edges, and that's called aliasing. Much like the Maya software renderer, that's controlled by the number of samples that we run. The samplings in mental ray are not linear, they're exponential, meaning a move from 0 to 1 gives you more than you'd expect. A move from 1 to 2 is much, much greater. Again, it's an exponential. So you never really want to quite get up to max sample level 4 because you're talking about 256 samples per pixel as opposed to 64 at a max of 3. Again, it's exponential. You want to kind of watch that. In my experience, I haven't found much need to go above max sample 3 because you really want to control using the anti-aliasing contrast, also known as the contrast threshold. This number, the lower it is, the more it forces the renderer to sample at the higher setting, which in this case is right now 64. Let's go ahead and set this to 2 instead. That's quite a big leap from what we had before, which was at -1. So we'll take a look at this render. Now, as you can see in this completed render, there's quite a huge difference. Not only has it fixed the jaggies on the edge of the render, but it's also cleaned up a lot of the noise inside the objects as well. We can further clean up this render by lowering the anti-aliasing contrast. Let's set this to a much lower number. Let's go to 0.02. That will force more of the image to be sampled at the higher rate, which is 16 samples per pixel. Lowering the contrast threshold is much faster than just plainly turning up the max sample level. It incurs less render time for appreciably better quality. We will put this in the buffer and go ahead and render. Now, as you can see in this render, we have a much, much cleaner render than we did before. It's practically noise-free. All that grain inside is pretty much gone. But we went from a 17-second render to a 1 minute 16 render. That's quite a big jump. However, it is pretty worth it because we have a clean render. And we got that by just lowering the contrast threshold and not simply upping the max sample level. This is very important to understand to get good quality renders without breaking the bank for time. The multi-pixel filtering lets you have a little bit of control over how sharp some of these images and how the noise is slightly filtered out to be less distinct. With a box filter, it does a pretty nice job of cleaning out the noise. A Gauss tends to make things just a little bit softer, and a Mitchell gives you the sharpest of the filters at a slightly higher rendering cost. Turning on motion blur in Mental Ray is really quite easy. In the Quality tab is the motion blur head at. There are two types of motion blur in mind. There's a non-deformational, which works for most scenes, and a full motion blur, which works for objects that are deforming, such as characters. For example, a character bending an arm would need to have a full motion blur turned on. Non-deformational works for solid objects that are moving or camera movement. We'll set ours to non-deformational, and we'll go ahead and put a little bit of a camera move on our objects. And here we go. We've created a quick camera move here to take a look at the motion blur settings. We have the non-deformational blur set up. Now keep in mind our render settings under quality. We still have a pretty high render time. So let's go ahead and turn this down just a little bit. We'll go to 0.08 to have a slightly faster render. And we'll go to a Gaussian, which works pretty well with motion blur due to its slight softness. Go ahead and pull this up. We'll put this in the buffer and render. As this render finishes, you can see a very nice motion blur coming off of the camera on these objects. Now, to mitigate some of this noise, you would play with the min and max sample levels and, of course, the anti-aliasing contrast ratio to make things a little bit cleaner. Now we have just under a 2-minute render here, and if I decrease my contrast ratio to what we had before, a 0.02, we'll be looking at a much cleaner render, but probably twice as long of a render time. That just about does it for the Quality tab. The Indirect Lighting tab gives you access to turning on indirect lighting. We've got Features, which gives you easy access to turning on and off the motion blur, as well as globally turning on and off shadows for any lights that may be enabled in the scene. You can also turn on some of the indirect lighting options directly in the Features tab. Passes tab allows you to render Mental Ray in several passes for later compositing. Again, this is an advanced topic, but well worth looking into once you're much more comfortable with Mental Ray and Maya in general. In this video, we took a look at the render settings for Mental Ray and saw how sampling levels are used to create clean renders, and also took a look at how motion blur is enabled and utilized.